when they come. So we're going to talk about Chapter 1 today, which is basically kind of an overview of Texas history of the state through the 21st century, and a little bit on some of the issues that we're facing as a state. So the lecture we'll try to post them before class. That way you have access to the notes if you want to print them out. I'm just going to go ahead and pull up the lecture. Okay. Great. And as we go along, if you have questions, feel free to use the hand raising icon or type a question into chat. And if you need me to repeat something, just let me know.
Where's the hand raising icon?
It should be at the center of your screen near your microphone and video icons.
Oh, yeah, I found it. Thank you.
Okay. If you don't have it, you can always just type it into chat as well. That's not a problem. Okay. So a lot of this will probably be familiar to you from high school classes, maybe even a college history class. This may just be kind of a refresher for you all. So of course, Texas used to be part of the Spanish Empire. Oh, not a problem, Evelyn. Thank you for letting me know. Yeah, that's totally fine. Not a problem at all. Okay. Yeah. Of course, originally part of the Spanish Empire, right? So extending, of course, through Mexico, Central America, and so on. So the first American settlers came when Stephen Austin was given land by the Spanish to essentially help settle Texas. And here's an interesting point. Of course, Spanish was the official language. So when people tell you, you should speak English in Texas, maybe remind them that Spanish was the first language here, not English. So they maybe want to, keep in mind that Spanish was spoken first. Also, the settlers were required to accept Catholicism. A lot of them weren't Catholic, but they had to accept the religion as valid and allow people to practice the religion. And slavery was illegal in Mexico, which Texas was technically a part of, but Texas ignored that rule and practiced slavery anyway. Also, they weren't quite as good about that whole let's accept Roman Catholicism as maybe they would have liked to have been. So if you're wondering why Spanish is prevalent here and the Catholic religion, well, part of it's history, right? Part of it is the fact that this was once part of Mexico and that we share a border with Mexico today. Okay, any questions before I move on?
No.
Nope, everyone's good? Okay. And then, of course, comes the revolution, right? There comes a point at which it's not viable anymore to have this clash between people who want slavery and to speak English and people who want slavery to continue to be illegal and for Spanish to be the language. So Texas essentially declared independence, and we don't want to be part of Mexico anymore. So then we get the famous Battle of the Alamo and the famous Battle of San Jacinto, 18-minute battle where Texas became an independent nation. So for a brief period of time, Texas was its own country. That's why you'll sometimes see people wearing a shirt that says, like, make Texas a country again, things like that. But Texas pretty quickly discovered, of course, that it's hard to be an independent nation when you're essentially surrounded by the United States. It's hard to come up with your own currency, trade deals, language, etc. So the people of Texas began saying, you know what, maybe it would be to our advantage to join the United States. We could reduce our debts, we would be part of a larger system. Being independent isn't working out for us. So they said, okay, let's go ahead and join the US. And so in 1845, Texas became the 28th state to join the US. So when people say Texas should become an independent country again, they might want to keep in mind how expensive it would be and how hard it would be to travel from from Texas to New Mexico and need a passport to do so. It's not really a feasible option to become our own country again. Okay, any questions?
No.
No. Okay. Is a lot of this familiar to you all? Kind of reminds you of your history classes?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So when Texas, of course, there were about 5,000 slaves in the state, and the state, other slave-holding state admitted to the Union. So there's a lot of controversy over the idea of a slaveholding state being added to the Union. A lot of opposition, but eventually, of course, Texas was added as a slaveholding state. But of course, the tension reached a boiling point between the slaveholding states and the abolitionists in the North, leading to the Civil War. Texas decided to join the Confederacy, was not willing to give up slavery, so they became part of the Confederacy. So we had joined the US only 15 years earlier than we decided we were out the door and gone. So of course, Texas joined the Confederacy, which lost. And slaves in Texas were given their independence on June 19th, 1865, which is why Juneteenth is a big holiday here in Texas, why it's celebrated so widely by African Americans across the state. It's a day to symbolize their freedom, their removal from slavery. So that's why Juneteenth is a big celebration here in Texas. Because even though they've been granted independence earlier, it wasn't until June 19th of 1865 that slaves in Texas knew they were independent. But even though slavery was illegal, of course, the state legislature was going to pass black codes. You're probably familiar with Jim Crow laws. This was Texas's version, essentially, of it, legalizing segregation in public transportation, schools, hotels, rest stops, etc. So slavery was no longer legal, but that didn't mean that there weren't, of course, laws that discriminated against them. We also saw the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in Texas. Unfortunately, of course, they're still around, not as strong. There is still a KKK presence in a lot of states, including, of course. So, because of Texas leaving the United States and wanting to rejoin, Texas to rewrite the Constitution a couple of times, which we'll talk about next week. The new state constitution, the version that we have today, was written in 1876. This was the end of the post-Civil War Reconstruction era, and Texas was allowed to write its own constitution. So this is the version of the Constitution that we have. We have not rewritten the state constitution since 1876. We simply amended it hundreds of times. There's a lot of outdated amendments in the state constitution. But nonetheless, that is the version that we have. Our state constitution was written in 1876 and updated as needed. So then we get into the late 19th century. We saw the expansion of railroads across the U.S., and more than 32 million acres of Texas land were given to the railroads. So two of the biggest industries in Texas were agriculture, cotton, cattle, etc., and railroads. We also unfortunately saw the expansion of Jim Crow laws legalizing segregation and mass violence against African Americans. Between 1870 and 1900, about 500 African Americans were killed due to mob violence, including lynchings here in Texas because of the KKK. So there has been a history of violence against African Americans and, of course, Hispanic Americans here in Texas. And like a lot of other states, Texas would not allow the workers to unionize. Unions were not allowed to operate by the courts or the state government. No workers' rights, for example, no hazard pay, no safety protocols. You would work maybe 12, 14-hour days easily, no minimum wage, no protection on the job. But again, this was common all across the United States. Texas did get a little bit ahead of the curve because of the Populist Party. The Populist Party essentially came into being towards the end of the 19th century. They were advocating for monetary reform, end to the monopoly system, and making government accountable to citizens. And if this sounds familiar, it should, right? A lot of political ideas come and go. So the ideas of the Populist Party have been picked up again by Democrats, mostly in the 21st century. We'll hear people like Bernie Sanders saying we need to increase taxes on the wealthy, we need to hold corporations responsible. So even though a party may lose power, the ideas may linger. So the Populist Party was able to get some seats in the state, but they weren't strong enough to overthrow the Democratic stronghold. So they made some inroads, but they weren't as successful as they would have liked to have been. But nonetheless, because of their pushing, we did see some reforms at the end of the century. The Texas Attorney General was prosecuting antitrust cases, trying to break up big companies like Standard Oil, companies owned by people like Rockefeller and Carnegie and others who had a stranglehold on steel, railroads, oil, and so on. So there were some changes in the late 19th century for the better, and some, unfortunately, that were for the worse. By the way, the KKK has existed in pretty much every state. I grew up in Illinois, and where I lived, there was this place that was supposedly haunted. So the kids would all go out there to see the place. But they would always tell the kids, don't go to this place on Wednesday nights because you have to cross a bridge where the KKK holds their meeting. So KKK isn't just a Southern thing. They've unfortunately got a presence in just about every state. Okay, any questions, comments?
No, ma'am.
Okay. And this is kind of funny. So what ended up happening to that haunted place was someone was using it for a meth lab, so the police burned it down, which is also kind of quintessential Midwest. Yeah, gotta laugh at that a little bit.
What the heck?
Okay. So now we're getting closer to modern times. So obviously we found oil in Texas, right? Huge amounts of oil in Texas. We are one of the biggest oil producers in the United States. So Texas shifted a bit from agriculture to oil production. Where the U.S. ended up being a little bit ahead of the curve was that they were able to pass child labor laws prior to the U.S. government. We actually set some minimum ages to work in industries 13 years before the federal government did. So Texas was actually a little bit ahead of the curve on child labor laws and also taking action against some major oil companies to bust up monopolies. So in some ways, Texas ended up being ahead of the curve on this particular issue. We also, of course, implemented primary elections. Unfortunately, African Americans, Mexican Americans couldn't participate in Democratic Party primaries. They had to pass a literacy test. They had to pay a poll tax. Basically, they had to pay to be able to vote. And the Democratic Party at the time did not want African Americans and Latinos participating because they would vote Republican. So they made the party primaries white only. So minorities were not allowed to participate in Democratic Party primaries. And they also tried to block them from voting to keep the state Democrat. Keep in mind that what we consider today as Democrat and Republican parties are very different. Democrats used to be the party of segregation, favoring small government. Republicans used to be in favor of civil rights. It switched in the 1960s. When President Johnson began supporting civil rights, the South became Republican and the North became Democrat. When we're talking about Texas Democrats in this time period, it's a completely different party from what we see today. So the terms Democrat and Republican here have a very different meaning. Just something to keep in mind. Okay. Sorry, any questions?
No.
Okay. All right. So World War I to World War II, we had about 200,000 Texans serving in World War I. About 5,000 of them died, but not because of combat, mostly because of the flu pandemic. We were only in World War I for about a year, so the US contribution wasn't as severe. Also, of course, post-World War I, we had that major flu epidemic that killed millions of people globally. That is very similar to the pandemic we're dealing with today. So we had a lot of people serving in World War I, but the ones who died weren't from combat, they were mostly because of illness. And at one point, the KKK took over control of Dallas in terms of the government. They didn't like immigrants, they didn't like Catholics, and they didn't like African Americans. They were able to get their Senate candidate elected in 1922. So they actually made a bit of an inroad in Texas in terms of taking over control of Dallas. There's actually kind of a funny story about the KKK and the University of Notre Dame. The University of Notre Dame, if you're not familiar, is a Catholic university in Indiana. And a lot of the original students who went there were of Irish descent. So the KKK in the 1920s went to South Bend, Indiana to protest the Catholics and the Irish Americans. So they show up in South Bend, Indiana, only to face a massive rebellion by the students from the university. They got into fights with the KKK, and they threw potatoes at them, because of course potatoes are somewhat synonymous with the Irish. And the quarterback for the football caught the potato so well, they knocked out power to the KKK building and they let it out. So yeah, keep in mind the KKK was pretty much everywhere, and they didn't like Catholics, they didn't like Latinos, they didn't like immigrants, and they didn't like African Americans. Then, of course, Texas is pretty reliant on oil prices. The higher the price, the better the state economy. So, unfortunately, because of the Great Depression and the drop of oil in the 1930s, the Texas economy was hit really hard. Oil prices dropped from $1.10 a barrel in 1930 to 25 cents a barrel in 1931. So Texas got hit pretty hard by the Great Depression. Yeah, about 300,000 Texans were unemployed during the Great Depression. And Mexican Americans, African Americans were not able to get relief from social programs. They were barred from it by the state government. So Texas was hit pretty hard by the Great Depression. The New Deal did help Texas in terms of bringing in programs like building bridges, providing electricity, and so on. But what really helped pull Texas out of the economic slump was World War II. John Nance Garner was one of FDR's vice presidents, so he had a Texan as VP during part of the Roosevelt administration. There were Texans on important congressional committees. So Texas actually had some influence on the Great Depression policies and the New Deal. And we had about 750,000 Texans who served in World War II. Obviously, a lot more soldiers in World War II because we're from 1941, but the war economy really did boost the Texas industries relating to airlines, munitions, and so on were able to bring jobs and relief into Texas. So Texas really began to rebound during World War II and after. Also, John Nance Garner is famous for saying that being vice president wasn't worth a bucket of warm spit. So very, very visual kind of person. Okay, so after World War II, we did start to see more of a shift from rural to urban. The population became 60% urban in the 1940s. There was a moving away from relying on agriculture to relying on oil industries like technology, factories. There was a big factory in Dallas that made things like calculators, things like that, that were shifting the population from rural to urban. And of course, we've got several large cities in Texas now. We've got Austin, San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, all of which have a population of at least 1 million people. And Austin is one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. So we are seeing more people moving to urban areas and less of a rural population. We also saw the rise of Lyndon Johnson in 1948 in a somewhat controversial and very kind of hinky Senate election. Basically, it looked like he was going to lose. Then someone discovered a box of ballots that had been uncounted that gave him the seat with an 87 vote victory. That box of ballots was probably fake. It was probably a stolen election by the Democrats. And when his opponent started calling him landslide to mock, nonetheless, he did win the election. And of course, that's his rise to power, right? He becomes a senator, then he becomes vice president in 1960, and then he becomes president in 1963 when Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas. So, for better or worse, this pretty fraudulent election is the reason Johnson was able to become president. Sorry, there are still laws on the books requiring segregation. The state tried very hard to fight against Brown versus the Board of Education, which required desegregation in schools. And like a lot of other states, we were forced to desegregate schools, hotels, and others with the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act giving minorities the right to vote. So by the end of the 60s, minorities were allowed to run for office, to participate in elections, to go wherever they want without having to face. We then saw more minorities and women being elected because of this. The first African American was elected to state office in 1990. We've had Mexican Americans serving as Supreme Court justices here in Texas, Attorney General, and we had the first woman elected to the Senate from Texas in 1993, Kay Bailey Hutchinson. So it took a while for minorities and women to get elected, but we have had a female governor in Ann Richards, and we have had minorities serving in state office and, of course, federal office, Ted Cruz, of course, being one of them. There's also been wild fluctuations in oil prices. Oil prices went very high in the 1970s, collapsed in the 1980s. And Texas realized that they couldn't rely on oil prices to facilitate the economy, that taxes would have to be increased. So in 1987, taxes were raised by $5.7 billion to provide for the state's needs. And it was the largest increase in taxes in a state in U.S. history. So Texas has somewhat learned that relying on oil prices isn't a good way to keep the economy stable. And we've seen that happening now. When the pandemic started, people weren't able to leave their homes, so there was less demand for oil, and gas prices dropped to levels that hadn't been seen since the early 2000s. I hadn't seen gas prices as low as they went since I was a teenager, so it's been quite interesting. And Texas is a very rapidly growing state. By 1994, there were 18 million residents. That number has pretty much doubled since then. We are one of the fastest growing states. Austin is one of the fastest growing cities. We get a lot of people relocating to Texas because of no state income tax and the cheaper cost of living. So Texas is a very rapidly growing state. And the next census number should tell us exactly kind of how many people we're looking at here in Texas. Any questions or comments?
No.
Okay. Okay. So 21st century Texas. George W. Bush gets elected president in 2000. Also, a controversial election. There's a lot of concern over what had happened with the Electoral College and the very odd election in Florida with the infamous butterfly ballot. And we said then Governor of Texas, George W. Bush, won the presidency. So he comes into office and faces a lot of challenges. Enron collapses early 2001. It was a major industry here in Texas, a high-tech industry, and it caused the stock market to collapse, well, not collapse, but drop, cause major recessions for tech companies. Also, the people who worked for Enron were hit very, very hard. A lot of them had their retirement account tied to the company's stock. So someone who maybe had a retirement savings of $500,000 because of the stock price lost everything. So it hit the people of Texas pretty hard. And at least one of the leaders of Enron ended up in jail for what they did. And then, of course, not long after that, we get 9/11. Obviously, it hit, it was a major impact on the US overall, but it did hurt the economy as well. People stopped traveling, the airline industries were in trouble, the stock market took a hit, and there's the psychological trauma from 9/11 as well. Seeing the footage from 9/11, especially live, was very, very hard for people on that day. Very, very traumatic. The states also had to deal with hurricanes like Katrina, Rita, Hurricane Ike, cost the state $12 billion in damages. We've had, of course, Hurricane Harvey that hit Houston really hard, Hurricane Hannah that hit this area hard. We're still dealing with the cleanup from Hurricane Hannah. And it looks like Hurricane Laura may come in and hit the Gulf Coast pretty hard. So we may have another natural disaster hitting the state. And cleanup will probably be in the billions. Sorry for the background noise on my part. I'm in my apartment. Okay, so obviously hurricane damage, right, that's going to cause problems. The state's already dealing with the issues from the pandemic, the creation of field hospitals here in the valley, the number of people who've been impacted by the virus. So we're dealing with some interesting challenges right now. Is in heading into a recession, a pandemic, another hurricane bearing down on us. Not a great year for the state. We've also seen a rise in poverty. More than 18% of Texans live in poverty. We have the 11th highest poverty rate in the US. We've also seen a rise in crime rates. Part of that, of course, is due to the presence of the cartels from Mexico coming across the border, but also just the fact that the state population is increasing. The more people you have, the more crime there is. So the state is going through a pretty challenging time right now. And how we get through it, we'll have to see. It's going to take a while for the state to really rebound from all of these challenges. Any questions, comments?
No.
Okay. Okay. So Texas is in a unique position in that we have the ability to create our own kind of international relations. because we are basically very connected to Mexico, right? We've got this huge border with Mexico. We're able to create our own treaties with Mexico. We're not reliant on the federal government. So Texas has the unique ability to create its own kind of international relations with Mexico. Border, right? There's a lot of crossing, both legal and illegal, that goes on along the border. Some of it's controllable, some of it's not. Inevitably, people will find a way across the border. We also have issues with distributing the water from the Rio Grande River. It flows over 800 miles between Texas and Mexico. So we have to deal with who gets what, how much of the water stays on our side of the border, how much stays in Mexico. We've also seen a huge increase in international trade following NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement. There's what they call the NAFTA Highway, Interstate 35 between, it goes from Laredo to San Antonio, Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, and all the way up to Minnesota. So we see a lot of cross-border trade, a lot of agricultural products, a lot of trucks carrying goods across the border. So we do see a lot of that, especially here in the Valley, right? We've all seen the trucks and cars from Mexico. We've seen that along here. We also have to deal with issues about water agreements. When there's a drought, what happens? Mexico will cut its water shipments to Texas in half during a drought, which then causes Texas to say, but we need the water, and Mexico to say, we need the water. Who gets what? That's an issue that pops up every time there's a major drought. Both countries, both Texas and Mexico need access to the water for agriculture. But the question then becomes, well, who's getting what part of the water? How do we decide how to deal with that during a drought? It's an ongoing issue that we have to deal with. And of course, there's also the dispute over the border wall. Obviously, Mexico is not going to pay for this wall. Also, the reality is you can build a bigger wall and people will find a way over it. They set up a section of what the wall would look like in Texas, and two girls took a ladder and it took them about 10 minutes to scale the wall and climb over. So the reality is there's no way to 100% shut down illegal crossings at a border. People will find a way around it. They'll dig under, they'll go over. And there's too many places where the border is so porous, there's just no way to control immigration. So immigration, both legal and illegal, is a problem we're just going to have to keep dealing with. There's no way to really effectively shut down illegal immigration. It's going to happen no matter what. Okay, any comments, questions, thoughts?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about Texas political culture, Texas kind of political beliefs. So there's three different types of political culture that we tend to see in the United States. The first is called a moralistic culture. This is where people believe that political participation and government activism on behalf of the common good is important, that the state and the nation are designed to further our shared interests, that you should vote, that you should protest, show up to city council meetings, meet your senator, participate in the system. So moralistic cultures found in states like Washington and Minnesota. An individualistic culture says the state and the nation are marketplaces for people to improve themselves. Basically, that political participation is done to further your own interests and to promote private opportunity. That basically it's every person for themselves, use the government to help yourself, and not to help anyone else. It's up to you to decide how you use the government. So this is found in states like Nevada. The traditionalistic culture is one that basically says you need to allow the elites to make decisions. One that discourages citizen participation. Also one that says if you have an unpopular religious belief or you're an unpopular ethnic group, don't even think about trying to participate. So for example, Muslim Americans would be strongly discouraged from participating in the system in this type of culture. They would be seen as an unpopular religious minority who shouldn't try to change things, who should just sit down and be quiet. So Texas is a bit of an odd mix of traditionalistic and individualistic. People take a lot of pride in the fact that they're Texans. There's a lot of every person for themselves. Do what's best for you. Take advantage of the system to help yourself. So Texas is kind of an odd mix of look out for yourself unless you're someone we don't want to participate in the system. Does this make sense? If you need me to clarify, let me know.
I think we're good.
Okay. Okay. So, like I was just saying, there's a lot of strong state patriotism, right? God bless Texas, glad to be a Texan. Very strong kind of pride in the state, which is unusual. You don't see that in a lot of other states. Texas does take a lot of pride in calling yourself a Texan, identifying as a Texan. The state is also politically fairly conservative. The state government does tend to minimize the role of the government in terms of the economy. It's pretty stingy with its aid. We rank 44th in the nation in welfare benefits, which means we give out very little. And we rank dead last in assistance for healthcare for women, infants, and children. Yeah, not something we should be proud of, but there you go. So the state does tend to be pretty conservative and does tend to say, don't spend what money we have on welfare or healthcare or education. Now there is, of course, Texas liberalism. There are individuals who do support protections for workers, more spending on social benefits, regulations on things like the oil industry. We do have liberals who do get elected to office, especially in major cities like San Antonio, Austin, Houston, and some liberal policies are adopted by the state. Not as much these days. The state's pretty conservative on a lot of issues. For example, there's restrictions on abortion clinics. So there's only one clinic in the Rio Grande Valley that's licensed to perform abortions. So the state, policy-wise, is pretty conservative. Okay. Any thoughts, questions, comments?
No.
Okay. All right, so in terms of the economy, Texas is a wonderful state to own a business. It is consistently ranked as the best state for business by CNBC and corporate CEOs because of low corporate taxes, weak labor unions, and a weak state government. So if a company is looking to relocate, Texas is often at the top of their list. Companies like Tesla want to relocate to Texas. Amazon, tech companies are constantly relocating to Texas because of the favorable business climate. Now, it's a great state for business. It's not a great state for workers. Texas gets a D in terms of earnings and job quality, an F in quality of life, and a D in resource efficiency. We're not as good about recycling and minimizing resource use as we should be. Outside the major cities, you're only making minimum wage in most jobs, which unfortunately hasn't gone up in 10 years. So that does mean there's not a lot of money being made by Texans. So it's a great state for businesses. It's not a great state for the workers. So keep that in mind. We also don't spend a lot of money on education, health, welfare, the environment, or the arts. Because there is no state income tax, and because of the low business taxes, there's not a huge amount of money in the state. And the minute we get hit with a recession, they slash spending on education, on health, and on social programs. So again, this is a great state for business, and it's why it's popular with businesses, but it's not a great state for workers. We would need to make some pretty significant changes to improve earnings and quality of life here in Texas for the workers. We also, unfortunately, tend to have a regressive tax policy. The burden for paying for taxes in Texas falls more heavily on the poor than the wealthy. Taxes in Texas are largely collected through sales tax and property tax, fees for driver's licenses or ID cards, all of which hit poor people harder. Sales tax can be very heavy on an individual making the minimum wage. Gas taxes can hurt lower income Texans. So unfortunately, our tax system is set up to where people who are poor pay a higher burden than people who are wealthy. So for that to change, we'd either have to introduce a state income tax, which is not likely to happen, or increase business taxes. But for now, the system unfortunately tends to favor the wealthy, and poor Texans are left out. All right, so in terms of citizens and who makes up Texas, in 2010, In that census, 38% of Texans were Hispanic, 12% African American, 44% identifying as white/non-Hispanic. Obviously, that's going to change when we get the next census data. What this means is there is no majority ethnic group in Texas. And in all likelihood, when we finish the census processing for this year, the majority ethnicity in Texas will likely be Hispanic. So we will become, and probably are at this point, what they call a minority-majority state, where the majority of the people are made up of a group that's considered an ethnic minority. So that may change some of the state makeup, some of the state politics. So we are seeing a shift in terms of ethnicity and demographics here in Texas. In terms of income, unfortunately, Latinos and Blacks only make up about 62% of what white household incomes make. So minorities do make significantly less money compared to white Texans. Part of that is the type of job. If you're working in a blue-collar industry, if you work in a supermarket, if you are a receptionist, you're not going to be making as much money as someone who works for Amazon or a bank. So part of that's tied to work, and part of that is just the history of inequality means minorities just haven't yet caught up to white Texans. So again, that may change because of the fact that the state will likely become Hispanic majority. And we're also likely to see a change in state politics because of the population shifts. Statistically speaking, Hispanic Americans do tend to lean Democrat. That doesn't mean they're all Democrat, of course. Every group has differences. But we may start to see Democrats getting elected to state office again. And because we're seeing more people moving from states like California to Texas and promoting more liberal ideas, the state politics may change in the next decade or so. We may see a Democrat becoming governor again. We may see a demand for more money being spent on social programs, increasing the minimum wage, and so on. So the state's kind of in an interesting time period. We're having this shift demographically. We're going to become one of the few states that has a minority-majority population. And we're seeing kind of a shift in ideas from pretty conservative to a bit more liberal. Obviously, I don't think it'll be an overnight shift, but I think the state may see another shift in terms of governance and parties in power within the next decade. Okay, any questions, comments? You see the hand raising icon. How many of you have received a census form in the mail?
Received the what?
How many of you have gotten your census form in the mail? Have gotten the census form to fill out?
Oh, not me. I don't think so.
I haven't gone to go check the mail.
Or what they're doing is some people, they're sending them the form, and some of them they're saying go ahead and do it online.
Who's even supposed to be receiving that?
You should have already, if not, probably very soon.
Oh, okay.
It's just going to become addressed to the residents of the house. It's not going to be addressed to you specifically. It'll just say the residents of whatever your address.
Yeah, buddy.
Yeah, we already did them.
Yeah, I've already done mine. Mine was pretty easy because I'm the only person in my household, but yeah, if you haven't gotten it yet, you should soon.
Oh.
I have a question.
Sure.
It's gonna be recorded, right? So I can like look over to see like the important things that you pointed out. Because I was trying to write them the whole time, but sometimes like it's just too fast and I don't remember. So I'm just trying to get like the important things.
I apologize. I tried to slow down my speaking, and I know I talk really fast, but yes, it is recorded. And I'll send a link to you all to the video on YouTube. I'll try to slow down a little bit more.
Okay. Yeah. So that's my question.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions, comments?
We will be doing class through the rest of the week.
Yes. Next week is when half of you will be in the classroom on Monday, and the other half will be on Wednesday.
Okay. Have you already made the list, or do we tell you like what days?
Yes, I've made the list, and I'll email you again with exactly who's on Monday and who's on Wednesday.
Okay, yes, because I was a little bit confused about that too.
I'm sorry, what?
I was a little bit confused about that too, about what day I'm supposed to go.
Yeah. So, okay, so if you are in class on Monday, let's say on Wednesday, if you are available, you can collaborate during that time. I will be recording the class in the in-person section, so you can follow along and you can ask questions. You don't have to be online if you can't. If you can't be, for example, the lecture will be recorded and you will be able to watch it later. So if you can be online, it gives you the chance to ask questions during that class as well. But if you can't, the lecture will be available later.
While the classes are online, attendance for like us that attended today or anything.
I'm not taking attendance this week other than to check and make sure people were in class the first week. Next week, when we are in person, the day you're in class, so for example, Evelyn, when you're in class on Wednesday, that's when I would take attendance. The day you're online, I do not take attendance for that. I can't. I'm not allowed to take attendance for the day you're online. But the day you're in person, that's when I would take attendance.
Oh, okay. I see.
Yeah. What I'm doing is checking to make sure students registered for class have actually shown up to class, letting me know they're in the class. That way, I can tell people, this person showed up for class, don't drop out.
Okay.
Yeah.
You got my message when I said I didn't come to the first day, right?
I'm sorry?
Through the chat, you received my message?
Yes. Yeah, you're fine. You're fine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Basically, the first week, what they want to know is have students showed up in some capacity. Online, contacted us, let me know that they're here, basically, that you're here, that you're in the class.
All right.
So, yeah, if people can make it Monday because of all of the craziness, it's not a problem. I know Monday was chaotic and people couldn't necessarily get into Zoom, so it's not a problem.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions? These are great questions, guys, so please, if you have any others, let me know.
Do we mainly need to focus on dates and stuff like that?
In terms of, Sorry, focus on dates for what, Eric?
Just focusing on dates. Like, do we need to like know like dates and stuff?
No. So largely, how the exams are going to work is they are open book. So what I want you to focus on is kind of the key concepts. So things like how the state government works, the creation of the Constitution. Dates aren't as important, and you don't need to memorize anything in my class. Um, I know it's hard to hold on to dates. It can be hard to hold on to statistics like 38% Hispanic population, but I don't ask you to memorize or really hold on to that information. I just want you to be able to understand the key concepts and kind of apply them.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
No, not for me.
Okay. All right, so next week we're going to start on Chapter 2. We're going to discuss the state constitutions. So for Monday, please read the first half of Chapter 2 as outlined in the syllabus. I will email you all again to let you know who's on Monday and who's on Wednesday. If you have any questions between now and Monday, feel free to email me or call or text me. And I look forward to seeing you guys on Monday. Good luck with the rest of your classes this week. Enjoy your weekend. Stay safe.
I'm sorry, what would